Imagine realizing that losing your car keys or getting stuck in really bad traffic or even just having a super awkward conversation at a coffee shop was the exact precise moment that altered the entire trajectory of your nation's history.
It is wild to think about.
It really is. So today we are doing a deep dive into how the most annoying, mundane inconveniences often serve as the raw material for sweeping historical change. But before we get into the actual mechanics of how that happens,
Yeah,
I want to start by offering a genuine divine blessing for you, your day, and your upcoming week.
absolutely.
Whatever you have facing you right now, I just really hope you find strength, wisdom, and clarity as you navigate it.
That is a wonderful way to start. And it's actually incredibly fitting for the source material for today's deep dive. We're looking at the introductory notes from a highly regarded study Bible, specifically the Holman and NAA compilation, and we're focusing entirely on the ancient book of 1 Samuel.
Right, and I want to be clear right off the bat, this isn't some dusty, irrelevant history lesson about people who, have nothing in common with you.
Not at all.
We're basically looking at a blueprint of human nature. The notes unpack this massive societal shift, the crushing psychological burden of leadership, and really the ultimate transition period of an ancient nation that is just desperately trying to figure out its identity.
Yeah, the book of 1 Samuel bridges a massive historical and structural gap. It documents the incredibly painful, chaotic transition of Israel from a loosely organized tribal league, which was essentially a theocracy relying on divine intervention, into a centralized bureaucratic monarchy.
Which is a huge leap.
Oh, massive. And to really grasp the weight of that shift, we have to understand the sheer unadulterated chaos of the world these people were living in right before the opening chapter.
Right. So the preamble to this whole situation is what historians call the period of the judges. And just reading the study notes on the backdrop of this era, I mean, the volatility is staggering.
It's intense. There is this deeply entrenched generational pattern the notes call the cycle of apostasy.
And he keeps repeating, right?
Exactly. It was a brutal, predictable rhythm that went on for centuries. First, a generation would fall into idolatry, essentially abandoning their foundational values and adopting the practices of the surrounding cultures.
Which obviously causes problems.
Right. So second, because of that internal decay, a surrounding enemy nation would easily come in, conquer, and oppress them.
Naturally.
Then third, the people, in their absolute desperation and suffering, would suddenly remember their roots and cry out to God for rescue. And fourth, God would raise up a localized, charismatic military leader, a judge, to violently liberate them.
But the catch is, the second that judge died, the people would just develop this collective amnesia and slide right back into step one.
Over and over again.
Yeah, and the text provides this single defining quote that I think just perfectly captures the chaotic motto of this era. It says, "In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes."
That one sentence really explains the immense pressure cooker that leads directly to the events of 1 Samuel. It was an era defined by a total lack of central authority and a complete collapse of moral and social cohesion. Because when everyone does what is right in their own eyes, you don't get a utopia.
No, you get anarchy.
Exactly. You get absolute chaos.
So the way I process this, because ancient history can be tough to visualize, is through the lens of a modern startup company that has just grown way too fast.
Oh, that's an interesting comparison.
Right. So imagine a company operating out of a cramped garage. There's no CEO, no real hierarchy, no middle management, definitely no HR department.
Just vibes.
Yeah, just everyone doing their own thing, building whatever future seems, right in their own eyes. And at first, that freedom feels incredibly liberating and agile. You make your own hours, you move fast.
But the agility really only works when you are small and isolated.
Exactly, given enough time. And say the company scales to like 500 employees. Suddenly, that complete lack of structure turns into a daily nightmare.
Right, projects overlap, payroll gets botched.
Yeah, and worst of all, the massive, highly structured corporate competitors start eating your lunch. So eventually, the board and the employees get so exhausted by the daily grinding chaos of this so-called freedom that they just march into a room and demand a rigid, traditional corporate structure.
They demand a CEO.
Right. They want to be just like all the other companies out there.
Yeah.
Because being unique has just become way too painful.
That maps perfectly onto the historical situation. The Israelites looked at the surrounding nations, specifically the Philistines, the Ammonites, the Moabites, and saw that they all had kings.
They had structure.
Yes. They had structured standing armies, they had central taxation to fund infrastructure, they had a visible human leader who could just march out in front of them and negotiate treaties or fight battles.
And Philistines are pretty intimidating, right?
Very. They had advanced iron technology and a highly organized military. So the Israelite tribal league model, which relied on a temporary militia and invisible divine protection, it just felt entirely too vulnerable. They demanded a king simply to survive the geopolitical landscape.
So that transition from the messy startup to the rigid corporation is with the author of 1 Samuel documents. But the study notes highlight a specific literary choice the author makes here, which I found fascinating.
Yeah, they didn't just write a dry timeline of events.
Right. No one wants to read a list of new tax policies or military drafts. They wrote a hero narrative.
Because massive structural transitions are rarely driven by abstract policies. They are driven by the character and the psychology of the people leading the change.
Yeah.
So the text of 1 Samuel is intensely focused on the internal lives of three main figures. You have Samuel, who is the prophet, acting as the crucial bridge between the old era of judges and the new era of kings.
The transitional guy.
Exactly. Then you have Saul, the tragic first king. And finally, David, the archetypal fugitive who eventually assumes the throne.
And the way the author handles the transfer of power between these three is just brilliant storytelling. The notes describe this deliberate technique of contrasting ascensions and falls.
Right, it creates this sort of cinematic X pattern in the narrative.
Yeah. Early in the book, you watch the simultaneous, disgraceful fall of the corrupt high priest Eli and his sons, perfectly contrasted against the pure, steady rise of the young boy Samuel.
The author uses the structure to force the reader into constant comparison. You aren't just reading history, you are evaluating character.
And then later in the book, they deploy that exact same technique on a much grander scale. You watch the tragic, spiraling descent of King Saul into paranoia and violence, contrasted directly with the steady, providential rise of young David.
Yes.
They're literally crossing paths on the way up and the way down, interacting with each other as their trajectories intersect.
And Saul is the total embodiment of what the people asked for. The text explicitly notes he had everything going for him outwardly. I mean, he was tall, handsome, a skilled military tactician.
He looked the part.
He looked exactly like a king, but his internal character, his heart, was entirely unequipped for the spiritual demands of the office.
Okay, but wait, I have to push back here with a philosophical question based on the text. If God is omniscient and directing this history, he obviously knew Saul was going to spiral into violent paranoia and drag the nation down with him, right?
Right.
So why grant the request for a king in the first place? Isn't giving them Saul just a profoundly cruel lesson in, like, be careful what you wish for?
It's a great point, and the study notes actually dive deeply into the theology behind that exact dilemma. The text suggests that the people's demand for a king was wrong-headed, not because monarchy is inherently evil, but because their specific motivation was to replace God.
Okay.
They were exhausted by the vulnerability of relying on invisible, providential care. They wanted a tangible, human king they could see, measure, and ultimately control.
They wanted a shortcut.
Exactly. So God grants the request and gives them Saul, but God does not abdicate his throne. He gives them a king to act strictly as his vice-regent.
Meaning the human king is essentially middle management.
Yes. The human king was supposed to be a representative, completely responsible to God, and entirely subject to the orders delivered by the prophet.
Okay, that makes sense.
Giving them Saul proved a massive necessary point. True leadership, even human leadership, still requires total submission to a higher authority.
Right. You can't just go rogue.
No, and a king who tries to operate autonomously, relying solely on his own political instincts as Saul did, will ultimately destroy himself and fracture the nation. Saul's failure was the painful proof that simply having a human monarch wasn't a magic cure for their societal chaos. The obedience of that monarch was the only thing that mattered.
Which sets up something that I think is truly captivating in these study notes. Because, I mean, we are talking about sweeping changes in national security, the formation of a monarchy, the clashing of empires. But the text focuses intently on how these massive historical changes actually materialize.
The overarching theme of providential direction.
Yes. It is rarely through, lightning bolts from the sky or parting seas. It happens through the incredibly boring, sometimes painful, highly specific details of everyday life.
The mundane things.
Exactly. The source emphasizes that the grand plan of history is fulfilled through ordinary, often frustrating human experiences. Like, It's basically the ultimate butterfly effect.
Well, think about the catalyst for this entire transitional era, the birth of the prophet Samuel. It doesn't begin with a geopolitical crisis or some summit of tribal leaders.
Right.
It begins with a deeply personal, bitter domestic rivalry. A woman named Hannah is dealing with the profound grief of infertility, and she's being constantly maliciously provoked by her co-wife, Peninnah.
Which is just awful.
It is, and that intense, localized personal grief drives Hannah to pray desperately at the local sanctuary.
And that single prayer leads to the birth of Samuel, the man who will eventually anoint the first two kings of Israel and fundamentally alter the government. It forces you to look at modern, daily inconveniences totally differently. It's like, missing a flight or dropping your phone and shattering the screen or taking a wrong turn in a new city. We view those things as total annoyances, but 1 Samuel frames them as the exact raw materials used to shape the future.
And Saul's introduction to the narrative is the perfect example of that mechanism at work.
Yeah.
Before he is a king, he is just a young man whose father's donkeys have wandered off.
Right, the lost donkeys.
Yeah, he is sent on a multi-day trek across the countryside just to find them.
Which is the most frustrating chore imaginable. I mean, he's lost. His servant wants to turn back. They are out of food. And because he is hopelessly lost looking for livestock, he happens to wander into a town where the prophet Samuel is visiting.
Right place, right time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He bumps into the one man who is holding a flask of oil, waiting to tell him he's going to rule the nation. If the donkeys don't run away, the monarchy doesn't happen.
And David's entrance onto the national stage operates on the exact same principle.
Oh, absolutely.
The story of David and Goliath is the archetypal battle of the underdog, known globally. But the mechanics of how David actually gets to that battlefield are incredibly mundane. He isn't a drafted soldier. He isn't some military strategist. He is a kid running an errand.
His dad basically tells him to act as the ancient equivalent of a pizza delivery boy.
Yes.
He's like, take some roasted grain and 10 loaves of bread to your older brothers who are stationed at the front lines and just check on them.
That simple menial task puts him in the exact physical location required to hear the giant's challenge. The text is demanding a complete shift in perspective from the reader. The macro-level history is entirely dependent on the micro-level obedience in these seemingly unimportant moments.
But the notes also clarify a very important distinction here, which we have to talk about. Just because there is a hidden, providential hand guiding the macro-level history behind the scenes, the individual is never let off the hook for their choices.
Not at all.
The study notes take a very severe view on the consequences of human actions, particularly regarding leadership and sin.
The text draws a profound, heavily emphasized distinction between the spiritual forgiveness of a sin and the physical consequences of that sin.
Which is a tough pill to swallow.
It is. We see this vividly in the contrast between Saul and David. Saul disobeys direct instructions from God delivered by Samuel. He panics before a battle, sees his army scattering, and offers a sacrifice himself rather than waiting for the prophet.
And to a modern reader, Saul's infraction almost seems minor. I mean, he was scared. He wanted to secure God's favor before a battle, so he just did the religious ritual himself. Yet that single act of disobedience costs him his entire dynasty.
Because in the context of this theocracy, Saul's act wasn't just impatience. It was a structural rebellion.
Wow.
It was an assertion of total autonomy. He usurped the prophet's role, operating out of fear of the people rather than submission to the word of God. He proved he wanted to be an absolute monarch, not a vice-regent.
Which makes the contrast with David so complex.
Yeah.
Because David is positioned throughout the narrative as the good king, right? The one whose heart is aligned with God's purposes.
Yeah.
Yet David commits an absolutely catastrophic series of sins with Bathsheba. He abuses his immense power, commits adultery, orchestrates a cover-up, and effectively murders one of his most loyal soldiers. Objectively, to our modern sensibilities, David's actions seem way more horrific than Saul's improper sacrifice.
They are horrific, and the text does not shy away from the brutality of David's actions. But the crucial difference lies in the response to prophetic authority.
Okay.
When the prophet Nathan confronts David with his crimes, David doesn't make excuses. He doesn't try to execute the prophet to cover it up, and he doesn't blame the people. He yields entirely. He repents immediately.
Right.
And because of that submission, he is forgiven spiritually, his life is spared, and his dynasty remains intact.
But, and this is where the text is incredibly sobering, the study notes emphasize that the consequences of that forgiven sin pursued David relentlessly for the rest of his life.
Forgiveness did not erase the fallout. The sword never departed from David's house. His family descends into a nightmare of violence, betrayal, and a full-scale civil war led by his own son. The text shatters the illusion that spiritual forgiveness means a clean slate in the physical world.
A leader's actions create a wake that impacts everyone around them.
Exactly, and the consequences of David's abuse of power fractured his family and his kingdom.
It's just a heavy, unforgiving reality. Good leaders in this ancient narrative view themselves strictly as instruments for a higher purpose, completely subject to accountability, while bad leaders view their office as a tool for their own personal gain, security, and autonomy.
And, shifting gears slightly, the physical survival of this narrative, the manuscript itself, is just as complex and layered as the moral failures of the leaders it describes.
Oh, the messy human history of this divine text is absolutely fascinating. And I think most people assume these books just, floated down from antiquity, perfectly bound and formatted.
Right, leather-bound with gold edges.
Yeah. But originally, 1 and 2 Samuel weren't two separate books at all. They were a single, continuous scroll.
It was only much later, when Jewish scholars translated the Hebrew text into Greek, the translation known as the Septuagint, that the text was split.
Because of space, right?
Yes, Greek requires more vowels and takes up more physical space than ancient Hebrew. The translations simply outgrew the physical capacity of a standard scroll, so they just cut it in half, giving us 1st and 2nd Samuel.
And the authorship is an even bigger mystery. The book is named after Samuel, and ancient traditions suggest he wrote the early chapters. But as the study notes clearly point out, Samuel dies in chapter 25.
Which presents a bit of a problem.
Yeah. He obviously didn't write the back half of the book detailing events that happened long after his own funeral.
Scholars highly suspect that later prophets, such as Nathan and Gad, who were active during David's reign, finished compiling the history. They likely utilized various court records and prophetic archives. But the mystery deepens significantly when you examine the physical manuscripts we actually possess today.
Right, the Masoretic text.
Yes. The traditional Hebrew version of Samuel, known as the Masoretic text, is notoriously rugged and incredibly difficult for scholars to translate.
The notes mention that the Masoretic text differs heavily from those ancient Greek translations, and even from the older fragments they discovered in the Dead Sea Scrolls. I mean, there are missing words, bizarre grammatical structures, and sentences that just seem to double back on themselves.
For a long time, the academic consensus was that the Hebrew text had simply been corrupted over centuries of scribal errors. The assumption was that scribes just fell asleep at the wheel, copied things poorly, and that we should rely on the smoother Greek translation to fix the Hebrew text.
But the notes highlight a counter-argument that completely changes how you interact with the book. Some scholars argue that the Hebrew text isn't corrupted by clumsy scribes at all. Rather, its weird, disjointed structure exists because it was an oral narrative.
Which completely flips the paradigm. Written language demands linear logic, clean grammar, tidy paragraphs, but oral storytelling relies on rhythmic repetition, cyclical phrasing, pauses for breath, and summarizing refrains to help the listeners remember the story.
So when a scribe writes down an oral performance verbatim, capturing the exact cadence of the spoken word, a later reader looking at it on a page thinks it's a grammatical error. They see a repeated phrase and think it's a typo, when in reality it's just the natural rhythm of a human voice echoing around a fire.
Exactly. It wasn't meant to be read silently alone in a sterile library. It was meant to be performed and heard collectively.
Understanding that mechanism completely grounds the text for me. It wasn't poorly copied, it was faithfully transcribed, capturing the actual living breath of the tradition.
I agree.
I just think there's something profoundly beautiful in that. We are talking about a book that details the intensely messy, flawed, real human experience. The catastrophic failures of our leaders, our petty domestic rivalries, our deep personal tragedies. And the physical text itself, the very syntax on the page, bears this slightly messy, undeniably human fingerprint.
Was it standardized and sanitized?
No. It was carried through time by real, breathing people.
It anchors the divine message firmly in the grit of human reality, refusing to let us sanitize the past.
Which brings us to the ultimate takeaway for you today. We've traced this ancient nation's desperate demand for a king, hoping a centralized, visible leader would instantly fix all their chaotic problems and make them feel secure. But as we close, I want to leave you with something to ponder about your own life.
Because the core human impulse hasn't changed a bit in 3,000 years.
Not at all. We still constantly seek external solutions to bypass the hard work of internal transformation. we still crave a king in our modern lives.
We really do.
When the culture feels chaotic, when the economy is volatile, or even when just our personal lives feel entirely overwhelming, we look for a silver bullet. We desperately want a single charismatic politician who promises to fix everything overnight if we just give them enough power.
Or a new CEO who will magically fix a toxic work culture without requiring us to change our own habits.
Right. Or we place all our hope in some new disruptive technology, an app, an AI, some new system that promises to streamline everything, remove all the friction, and just make us like everybody else.
We want the benefits of order and security without the slow, grinding work of character building and submission. We want the shortcut.
And 1 Samuel stands as this brilliant ancient warning about the unforeseen, often devastating costs of placing all our hope in a single human or technological solution. When we demand a quick fix to bypass the chaos, we almost always end up trading our freedom for a system that eventually crushes us.
So true.
The text invites you to stop looking for a Saul to rescue you from the messiness of life and instead do the hard, quiet work of inner obedience. It asks you to trust the slow, providential process, even when it feels like you're just wandering around in the wilderness looking for lost donkeys.
Because the truest peace doesn't come from demanding a king to organize your chaos. It comes from recognizing that the mundane, frustrating inconveniences of today are the exact materials being used to construct your tomorrow.
God blesses all the listeners.